Hi, Lorraine. I'm going to try to get you caught up a little bit so that we can do a little bit during the week, maybe on videos, and then by the weekend we'll have more to talk about, more to go over, and I can do more quizzing and testing for you, and that might help you move this along because we do have a lot of years to get through. So last time we left off, we were talking about just prior to the Civil War. So let's try to get through that period. Some of the things I know that you are familiar with was the idea of sectionalism, and that was this country was being broken up in sections rather than just on ideas and beliefs. And a lot of that had to do with the agriculture and factories and what was people were able to do in different parts of the country, and people started to be divided by that. We went through a lot of that. So as we move forward, remember that at this time period, this was all leading up to the Civil War. Most of the controversies in the country at the time were about slavery. Even if they weren't speaking directly about slavery, anytime they were talking about the power in Congress or states' rights, they were basically talking about slavery because the states wanted the rights to have slaves in parts of the country. So there was always that worry about the balance of power in the Congress, that they might have their rights taken away, their right to have slaves taken away from the South. So it really was all about sectional rights, states' rights, but it mostly boiled down to slavery because it all was intertwined in that. Some of the conflicts that led up to it, of course, we've talked about many of those, some of the revolts, some of the northern states really not wanting to have slavery and wanting the South to get rid of it, and the South always saying that they were going to break away or secede if that happened. So remember all of Clay's compromises. He was the great compromiser, always trying to keep it from happening. And then you had Calhoun, who was always threatening to secede. So just keep those names kind of straight. Some of the literature we talked about at the time, a lot of transcendentalism, a lot of talking about nature and man's own ideas about his place in the world, and we talked about many of those writers, Emerson, Thoreau, so we covered those, just kind of remember those. Uncle Tom's Cabin was also important literature at the time that you need to remember. That was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and what is so important about that is that after the slave laws that we talked about that were so horrible, that made everybody get involved because you were required to take slaves back, even if they had escaped and were in a northern country. So she wrote a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin that was very difficult to read. If you have a chance to read it, I would suggest it, but it's difficult because there's so much sadness and pain, and because she really does get into the heart-wrenching descriptions about how the slaves are treated, especially this one that she bases it on, and it's pretty gruesome. Now, the good thing is it got attention and all over the country. A lot of people were very upset when they learned because a lot of people didn't know, didn't pay attention. They didn't realize, maybe, or at least they didn't want to admit how bad it really was. So he was at the run when they talked about the runaway slaves and the families and things that were happening. It really did cause a lot of people to get more involved in it. So, in fact, Lincoln even said when he met Harriet Beecher Stowe, he said, "So you're the little lady or little woman that caused this great war," or something, because it did kind of bring all of that tension, all of that anger, kind of a little bit to a head when it got out there about just how awful it was. All right. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was also important in this, all leading up, because if you remember, we talked about these states trying to stay even, and the idea of popular sovereignty, which is the idea that the states will make their own decisions. The people have this popular sovereignty means that those states have the right to make that decision, not the federal government. It's their area. I know we've also talked about the different parties and how they changed, the Democratic Republicans, the Whigs, the Know-Nothings, all of those. So the Whig Party eventually just kind of disappeared over the battle of the Nebraska-Kansas bill. So that party went away, so that's one less you have to worry about. Then you had the nativists, the American Party, remember the Know-Nothings who were so anti-immigrant. Some of the Whigs went there. People had to start taking sides as the whole idea of slavery came to a head, and getting close to the Civil War, people started having to take sides. Bleeding Kansas is, I think we did talk about this, a Bleeding Kansas where they were allowed to make their own decisions over slavery. it would come to a vote, but then you had all the people coming in from other states, stuffing the ballot boxes. They said there were border ruffians, which are just people coming across the border. And John Brown led a revolt that murdered pro-slavery farmers, and a lot of these violent acts were breaking out all over. And it was so then they were calling it Bleeding Kansas. So if you hear the term Bleeding Kansas, think about the fight over the whether to have slavery or not in Kansas, and the vote that was going on there, and the people that were going over the border and causing problems. So that's another one that's leading up, which I think we've talked about before. The Dred Scott case, I know we talked about before because you had it on one of your quizzes and you did great. So just remember that the Dred Scott case was about the slave who traveled through the free areas with his master, and because he had traveled through free states and free areas, he thought there was a point when he should be considered free, and he tried to sue for his freedom. And at that point, the court said that no, he can't sue for his freedom, that he's property. So that reinforced the idea that slaves were property of their owners, and that according to the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, you can't take away someone's property. So that was obviously a major case. The raid on Harper's Ferry, we talked about this, I think, it was John Brown, Harper's Ferry, Virginia. So if you just I'm trying to go a little fast, I know, but we have so much to cover. I want to hit the things that I think are going to be in the test, some of the names you need to know, the sequence of events. So as you read this or hear this and you want to stop it, of course you can. And then if you have questions, we'll go over them. Once you get to the point where we're taking the diagnostic test for this section, if you have any questions, if there are gaps, we'll just go back and fill them out. All right, so when we get to the main part right before the Civil War was the election of Lincoln. Lincoln was not an abolitionist. I think we also talked about this. That's a misconception. People think Lincoln freed the slaves. He was just so anti-slavery. That isn't what it was about. Lincoln was pro-union. He wanted the Union to stay intact, and he knew that slavery would probably pull it apart. So he was trying to protect the Union. He wasn't really trying to protect slaves, although he was anti-slavery. He just wasn't going to do anything that would affect the Union. So, but when Abraham Lincoln became president, there was obviously a lot that went on with that election and with the people. But there were warnings that a house divided cannot stand, that if people didn't join together, that, our country couldn't stay together. And that was years ago, had been said and been talked about. So you will hear that quote, a house divided cannot stand. And it was pretty much around the Civil War, before the Civil War, this was what that quote comes from. Basically saying it will be one thing or the other. And it's either going to be slavery or not, because obviously you can't have a divided country. It's just not working. All right. So when Lincoln became president, and I'm going to skip all the election things. I don't think you need to know that. There's always issues that come up and always 2 or 3 people, and you don't need to know that, I don't think, right now. But the pro-slavery people knew that he was not pro-slavery, and that he wanted to eliminate slavery, but he wasn't an abolitionist. He won by calling for no extension of slavery to the West. So he started saying he was going to have limits on slavery. So the whole southern tier, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, all voted to secede, which is to leave the Union, before he even took office. So once they knew he was going to be president, you have that time in our country where you're elected in November, but you don't actually take office until January. So it's called the lame duck session. And it's when you are, you're leaving and you know who's coming in, but you have to have that transition. So in that time period, those states said, well, we know he's going to be bad for us, so we're going to go form our own country, our own group of states. And they did. And they elected their own president, had their own Congress, so they broke away. And of course, the problem with that is that most people felt the Union, the United States, could not survive against the outside world, and could not survive if it's broken that way, that it needed to be put back together. And that facilitated the Civil War. Okay, so I'm going to stop there for a second. I'm going to move on to the next section. Okay, I'm going to give you a little timeline that might help you with some of the sections. So maybe if you just want to write this down or if you think it's important. 1850, the Fugitive Slave Law passed. We talked about that, which created a lot of problems in the North because all of a sudden they were drawn into it. Okay, 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin, the book by Elizabeth Beecher Stowe, was written, and that's the one that talked about what the life was like for a slave and how horrible it was, the runaway slave, how they were treated. It was so brutal and it was awful. That got a lot of attention, and especially with people in the North who were dealing with the fugitive slave law. At the same year, Franklin Pierce was elected president. You don't hear a lot about him, but he was. 1853, the American Party dominated the Whigs, took over kind of the Whigs. That's when the whole party kind of started changing. I know that gets complicated, so I don't think that's super important for you to know. But it did dominate many northern states. That Kansas-Nebraska Act passed. At the same time, the Republican Party formed. That's just what happened in that year. 1856, that John Brown led the attack on the farmers in Bleeding, Kansas, and we talked about that when they were trying to decide if they were going to have slavery or not, popular sovereignty, and people were coming over the borders causing fights. In that year, James Buchanan was elected president. These aren't our most well-known presidents, so I'm going to skip over them right now. They're not doing much for us, so I don't think you'll have to read about them a lot. So just know that James Buchanan was elected president. 1857, the Dred Scott case. Supreme Court decided the Dred Scott case, and it's probably good to know the date on that, 1857, because some of the cases that you are given on the test, it helps a lot to have in your mind when that happened so that you can separate it from other cases that come up later, especially in civil rights. 1858, Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas debate for the Illinois Senate. Those were some famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. That's how we know a lot about what Lincoln believed before he was elected president. 1859, John Brown organizes the raid on Harper's Ferry. 1860, Abraham Lincoln is nominated by the Republicans. The Democratic Party splits into two other wings. I'm not even going to go there. John Bell forms a Constitutional Union Party. I'm just giving you background. I don't think you need to know this. But it did make it a four-way election. Abraham Lincoln was elected. South Carolina, right away, said, we're out of here. They seceded in December. And I think I told you earlier, when a president in the U.S. is elected in November, we know who the new president is, but they don't take, he or she, hopefully someday, don't take office until January. So when the president was elected in November and it was Lincoln, South Carolina was the first to bail. They said, we're out of here. They seceded in November. The rest of that southern tier, which I think I gave you earlier, they got out of there right after that. So that was pretty much the climax of that's where the Union broke apart. Everything we talked about leading up to that, all the different decisions, all the balancing act of trying to keep slave and free states, states' rights, keeping Congress even. Every time we moved, we got new land, trying to figure out what to do with the states in terms of slaves. That all finally just came to a head. So he wasn't the cause of it, but it's kind of the final straw. So that is where we now can get into the Civil War. So that's a lot of background, and some of that overlaps, but I think it will help you with what's coming next, right? Okay, we're back, and now we're at the Civil War. So I'm going to go through basically based on what I know is on the test, and if I go too fast, obviously you can stop me and take notes. If I cover the information too quickly and you don't understand it, just make a note and email me, and then I will go into more detail for you when I see you on the weekend. I don't want to only teach you the test information. That's why we were talking more about history in its entirety, but I know we have a time limit. So I'm going to make sure you know the major information and battles, but if there's anything you have a question on, just let me know. Okay, so Civil War, 1861 to 1865. We now know what led up to it and what's happening now. So the turning point in American history at this point is the Civil War. It's probably the biggest thing since the Revolutionary War. So outside of the major battles, which we will cover because you do need to be able to recognize them and why they're important if you see them on a test, you also need to know about the Emancipation Proclamation, which we will cover. I think you actually know a little bit about that. The draft, social movements of the time, the Union and Confederate economies. Remember, the Union are from normally the North, and just think about what was going on in the North in terms of factories and their economy and what their economy was based on. And the Confederate economy. The Confederate is the South. So when you talk about the Confederates, you're talking about the South, the people, the states that seceded and left. And think about their economy and what they mostly did and what they mostly had and where they were in terms of the railroads and just their placement. Kind of remember the sectionalism, okay? So here's what you need to know. Fort Sumter, 1861. So you definitely want to be familiar with what that is. So it's Fort Sumter, Sumter, and 1861. The South attacked first and basically started the Civil War on April 12th, 1861. That's the day that there were the first battle, the first cannons fired, or the first something happened. No one was killed. It was initial bombardment near Charleston, South Carolina. 2 people died the next day from something else, but it wasn't like a huge battle, which you'll see happens every once in a while. It's just a thing to start it, something to get them going. And remember, the difference was the South wanted to break away and be left alone. They wanted their own country. They weren't fighting the North for anything, really. The North was basically the one saying, no, you can't secede. You can't leave us. You can't just break away and form your own country. You are part of the United States, and you can't do that. So their fight was to bring them back in, to beat them so they had to rejoin them. So just kind of think about what that's like. The South, the war will mostly take place in the South because you're fighting the people in the South who have kind of entrenched and said, no, we're not coming back. We're staying right here. And we're not going to listen to you or follow your rules or anything because we're our own country. All right. So anyway, that is when it first started. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But you do need to, in your head, have Fort Sumter, 1861, the first attack that started the Civil War. Now, who was fighting in the Civil War? All right, the North was called the Union. So whenever you hear the Union or the North, it's the same thing. There's the Union. That's President Lincoln. They wore blue uniforms. Their major force was the Army of the Potomac. They had multiple leaders, but their major force they were the Army of the Potomac Rivers, and is what's named after it. Potomac. They had multiple leaders. The last leader who ended up, winning the war at the end was Ulysses S. Grant. So obviously you have to know Ulysses, Ulysses S. Grant. He's known as one of the best leaders that our country's had in different battle wars, and you will always have a Ulysses S. Grant associated with the Civil War, obviously, and the Union side, so make sure you have those names all together, okay? Union, President Lincoln, Grant, he was at the end. There were others in that time period, but he was the one that was the most well-known and the one that you'll need to know. The South was called the Confederacy, okay? So anytime you hear the Confederacy after, at this time period, the Confederacy, because a Confederacy is a group of people, states, whatever, that gets together to form a bond. So they were a group of states that broke away, tried to form their own bond, association, country, and so they were called the Confederacy. So anytime you hear the South and the Civil War and the Confederacy, their president, because they elected their own president, because they wanted their own country, President Jefferson Davis. Okay, so if you hear President Jefferson Davis, don't get it confused with one of the United States presidents. He was the Confederate president. So they had their own guy. They wore gray uniforms. The major force was the Army of Northern Virginia. Anytime you hear Virginia, you're talking about the South. And so Northern Virginia, and that's Robert E. Lee. And that he's also very important because General Robert E. Lee if you're talking about the Civil War and you talk about the major commanders, you're going to hear Ulysses S. Grant for the North, and you're going to hear Robert E. Lee for the South, or the Confederates. All right, so just make sure you have those straight. All right, the North had the advantage because they had a larger population, a stronger navy, greater farm acreage that was food that could be eaten. Remember, in the South, they grew a lot of crops that were sold. You don't eat tobacco or cotton. So even though they had a lot of farmland and they weren't growing things that you could eat. So when the war really was, as the war progressed, it became harder and harder for the South because they didn't have the food, they didn't have the railroad transportation, they just didn't have the factories. They didn't have a lot of what was needed. They just had a lot of, plantations and cotton and things that you can't really eat. The North had the banks, the banking system, the bank deposits. They had more and better industry. They had the factories. They could make clothing, uniforms. They could produce other, food. And the North had the railroad track because most of the railroad was in the North. Okay, one of the things you need to remember is that Lincoln was not fighting to end slavery. I know we talked about that before, at least not in 1861 at the beginning. He was fighting to maintain the Union. That was his primary goal. He wanted to secure the border states and stop the Confederacy from expanding even further northward. The fear was that you had the first group or the second group that seceded, that they might draw others in, and then it becomes an even bigger problem. So he was trying to secure the border states to keep them from joining the South and to get the South back in. So that was the initial reason, and that's why we say he wasn't an abolitionist. He wasn't going out there to stop slavery. At the beginning, he was just trying to preserve the Union. Some of the things you need to know in terms of battles and campaigns is the Peninsula Campaign, Peninsula. That was the initial war strategy for the North. The Peninsula Campaign was going to follow the peninsula of Virginia and capture Richmond, which was the Confederate capital. So Richmond, Virginia was the capital of the new Confederate country. And they were going to go along the peninsula and capture that. Okay. That was just the initial plan. Didn't work. The Anaconda Plan, you need to know. Anaconda, like a snake, Anaconda, and some of the economies. So this is a little information that I know is on the test. So you need to be aware that the longer the war went on, the better it was for the North, because the South had a lot of cotton to export. They needed to get European trade. So the North just put its navy out there and was able to block the southern ports and keep the goods from coming in out of the Confederacy. So remember, the Confederates didn't have a lot of crops for eating. They had a lot of cash crops. They needed to sell. They needed to sell their cotton. And they needed to get it to Europe in order to do that. And the North had a better navy. They had a navy. So they just used it to blockade the ports in the South, so the South was not able to get their cotton out. The idea was to strangle them like an anaconda, which is why they call it the anaconda, big snake. The anaconda will squeeze you to death. So it was called the anaconda because the goal was it would squeeze its prey, which at that time was the South, by not allowing it to sell its goods, which is what they needed. So by the end of the war, there was massive inflation in the South and a shortage of common items that they needed, from clothing to food to everything that you normally think of. They had a shortage because they couldn't produce their own and they couldn't buy and sell because of the blockade. The North also had problems. They also experienced inflation, but remember, the war wasn't taking place mostly in the North. It was in the South or on the border. So the people in the North weren't suffering the same as the South. The North did experience inflation. There's always issues with the money and how much money is needed to run a war. So they had billions of dollars in greenbacks. If you hear the term greenbacks, just know that's paper money as opposed to the specie circular we talked about earlier, which was gold and silver, hard money. So paper money, greenbacks, they were put into circulation. And paper money causes inflation because it's not real. It's paper. So it's supposed to represent something of value, but it's different than having gold and silver. So that does cause problems. So the most famous battle of the ironclad ships, which is something you need to know, was between the Monitor, that's its famous ship on the Union side, and the Merrimack, which was on the Confederate side, which is also called the Virginia. So however you hear that. The Merrimack was trying to break the blockade, and there was a big battle. So the Monitor was one of the Union ships that was part of the blockade, and the Merrimack tried to break through the blockade, and a big battle happened. We don't have as many battles on sea, of course, as we did in the Revolution with Britain, because there wasn't a whole other country coming with their ships. So, but this would come up with the blockade because the North was blockading the South. What major battles in the East you need to know for sure? Let's see, before Gettysburg, which was the biggest one that you hear about in the Gettysburg Address, and you absolutely have to know that. But before that, Bull Run, that's one. And you might put a slash, Bull Run / Manassas Junction. So I'll spell that for you. Manassas Junction. And that's 1861. The Manassas Junction is the Confederate name for that. Bull Run is the North name. So, you know. That was the first big battle, and the place where Stonewall Jackson, very famous figure in the war, first earned his nickname, Stonewall Jackson. So the Union lost when they couldn't retreat on a road that was congested with picnic wagons driven by war spectators. And this is weird, but back then, war wasn't like it was today. It was a little more up close and personal. So people actually thought, oh, this war isn't going to be a big deal. There's some fighting out there. We'll get our picnic. We'll get our wagons. We'll go out and see what's happening. And they actually just caused a big traffic jam. So the Union actually lost, not because they didn't have the firepower, but because of the congestion and traffic by picnickers who were there to watch. I know, war spectators. All right, that's Bull Run, Manassas Junction, 1861. So the South will claim a victory for that. Another one you need to know is Antietam. It's ANTIETAM / Sharpsburg, 1862. Okay. That was the bloodiest single day in American history, with over 23,000 casualties. And so if you have any questions about the Civil War, it's a horrible, bloody war, and a lot of people died. But if you talk about the war that was the bloodiest single day, it's the Antietam Sharpsburg, 1862. 23,000 casualties. Lee couldn't move northward through Maryland, and no one won. But so many people died. But the Union claimed victory and issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which we'll go over later. So obviously these things are happening a little bit spread apart. The first one was 1861. The second one was 1862. So we're moving a little quickly through this war, but these are the major things you need to know. The battles, the commanders, those kind of things that we're talking about. So just kind of keep track of those. It's important to know that in the Eastern Theater, they call it theater in a war, but it's really just the location or place. Theater is just the area that they're in. The Union lost many of the major battles, including Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. Those were a little bit earlier on. But that was because they were in the East. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. Some of the Eastern battles the Union lost, Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. All right, the Emancipation Proclamation. I know you said earlier that you knew that wasn't Lincoln wasn't just there to free the slaves, but he is known for it because of the Emancipation Proclamation. There's a little bit of confusion there. It was issued by Abraham Lincoln after Antietam, Antietam, that battle. 23,000 people died on that battlefield. And it went into effect on January 1st, 1863. So here's what's interesting about that. Number one for the Emancipation Proclamation is it freed the slaves in the rebelling states. Interesting, because the states who were rebelling weren't going to listen to the president anyway. So the proclamation sounded good, but it didn't really free any slaves. So when you hear that the Emancipation Proclamation was Lincoln freeing the slaves, remember that the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves in states that we didn't have any control over. So it pretty much didn't free any slaves. But what it did do is it changed the ideas and the wording of the war. Because remember, the war started in 1861. This was in 1862, went into effect in 1863. It started signaling to people that now our goal in this war is to free the slaves. So that's where the change came about. It's like, you know what? Now we're trying to free the slaves. And one of the reasons that helped us is that it kept Britain out of the war. Britain was very tied to the South because remember, they buy a lot of cotton from the South, and they were getting pretty upset that the South couldn't get their cotton to them because they were involved in this war with the North and all of that. But the British did not believe in slavery. They had already abolished slavery decades before. So they couldn't support the Confederacy and the South if it was about slavery. So that was a way to say, look, we are trying to fight against slavery. So Britain, if you get involved, which could really change the war, because Britain had a lot of strength. If you get involved, you're on the side of people who want slaves. So that kept Britain out of the war, which was a big deal. That was a big deal. Earlier in the war, the Trent Affair, the Confederates were captured trying to negotiate an alliance with Britain. So the Trent Affair has to do with the Confederates trying to get Britain on their side. There's also some controversy over this, it's called Laird Rams, so you want to write that down. Laird, Rams, R-A-M-S. They're ironclad ships with iron that were a lot stronger, and the Confederacy could have really used them. And the claim was that they were being built in Britain for the Confederacy. So that is there was a controversy over that. So the North knew that the Britain was behind the scenes maybe going to help the South and the Confederates, and the way to stop that was to say, hey, we're on the side of anti-slavery. We're trying to abolish slavery, and they want to keep it. So when you turn the argument into pro versus slavery, it made the British back up and go, yeah, we can't really support you. So they backed away from the South, and that really hurt the South and really helped the North. So that was good. What you need to know about some of the African American troops is that at first slaves were acquired as contraband, basically taken and used by the Army for labor. The official first black regiment that was recognized by the Union Army was the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry. So this is a group of black African American men who joined the North to fight. They weren't kidnapped and made to fight as they were in the South sometimes. They were people who wanted to be a part of this. So they were the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, and they're actually portrayed in a movie called Glory. I don't watch war movies, so I haven't seen it, but I do know that their infantry is famous, and because they're the first black infantry group of soldiers. And so if you ever want to watch a movie about it, it's the movie Glory. They were earlier an unofficial black troop. So this is when they became official, part of the fight for freedom. All right. African American soldiers were paid a lower salary than white soldiers for most of the war. Go figure. Kind of like women right now. I mean, it is what it is. So at the time they were fighting, of course, they were paid less because they still weren't valued as being equal. About 180,000 black soldiers. They were about 10% of the army by the end of the Civil War. So by the end of the Civil War, 10% of the army was black. So they were African Americans. About 180,000 were fighting. So they had a big impact. And that's another reason the North wanted to make sure that everyone understood they were fighting against slavery, because then, of course, more of the African Americans would join the North to help fight against the slavery in the South. So 180,000, that's a lot. So it definitely was helpful. Even the Confederacy had plans for regiments in 1865, but I'm not sure how that would have worked, how you would get the African Americans to fight in against freedom. But that would have been for 1865, and then the war was over. All right, Gettysburg and Pickett's Charge, 2 things you need to know. So make sure you write down Gettysburg and Pickett's Charge. All right, I'll give you a little background, just off the test, so not too much, I promise. Remember General Lee, okay? General Lee was a general for the Confederate side at the end. General Lee and the Confederacy went as far north as Pennsylvania. So, I mean, they won some battles. They weren't losers all the time until the very end. So they got as far as Pennsylvania, and traveling to the north, they ended up in Gettysburg. It was a 3-day battle, and it was July 1st through 3rd, 1863. Okay. What's important to know about that is that the Union won, and it was a turning point of the Civil War. Okay, so the South and Lee made it as far as Pennsylvania, had a big 3-day war, Gettysburg, pretty bad, and it was a turning point of the Civil War. George Pickett of the Confederacy, Pickett's Charge is why I said that. If you hear about Pickett's Charge or George Pickett, he was on the Confederate side, and he led a charge across an open field and lost. So there were more casualties in those 3 days at Gettysburg than any other Civil War battle. Okay. Compared to the one I told you earlier, that was the bloodiest single day in history with the 23,000. So don't get those confused. This was a 3-day battle. So there were more casualties in the 3 days at Gettysburg than any other Civil War battle. So in November of 1863, Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address at that battlefield where so many people had died. And that's one of the reasons the Gettysburg Address is so well known and so powerful. I mean, so much had happened. The war had been going on now for 3 years. This is now, 1863, 2 years. It's been going on. A lot of people have died. Things are getting worse. And on that day, so many people died that on those 3 days that he delivered the Gettysburg Address. He spoke about freedom, equality, the importance of uniting the country, and talked about all the sacrifices that were made by the soldiers there on that field, and the fact that he was there on the field talking about that was important. So if you hear this, he began the speech, and this is probably the part you know if you know of it, 77 years ago. Right? That's the beginning of the Gettysburg Address. And he's referring to the Declaration of Independence, which was in 1776. So it was 77 years. A score is just 10 years. So 77 years ago. So he's talking about the Gettysburg Address. He's talking about the Gettysburg Address, but he's referring to the Declaration of Independence and what we were trying to do at that time and what has happened now. All right, okay, I'm going to stop there for just a minute. Of course, you have to know about the Gettysburg Address, and that was, I think I covered it a little bit earlier. He delivered it at Gettysburg on the battlefield, which makes it even more powerful after the 3-day battle that killed more than in any other war, any other 3-day battle. So it was 1863. He spoke about freedom, equality, the importance of uniting the country, and all the sacrifices made by those soldiers and he's standing on the battlefield where they had just all fallen, how so many had died. So the part you need to know is I think you need to recognize that if you hear 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. That is the beginning of the Gettysburg Address. You need to recognize that anytime you hear 7 years ago. A score is 20 years, so it's 87 years ago. So he's referring to that, and he's talking about now we're engaged in a great civil war, testing whether our nation that is so dedicated to democracy and freedom can survive. And he goes on to discuss that, question that, and talk about what we need to do in order to do that. I won't read the whole thing to you. You can look it up. But at the end, he just does say, we resolve that these dead, as he's at the battlefield, have not died in vain, that this nation under God will have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. So it's a very moving speech. But if you don't remember anything else, remember 7 years ago is the beginning of the Gettysburg Address, and the end is the idea that we need to get back to the government that we formed, and that these people will not have died in vain, and this is a government of the people, by the people, for the people, and it shall not perish from the earth. Very moving and very, very important speech at the time. So Gettysburg Address, definitely know that. Okay, moving on a little bit. The Copperheads. Okay, these are some terms you need to know. The Copperheads were peace Democrats in the North and the Midwest who were pro-Union but against the Civil War. They didn't think they were peace Democrats. They didn't think there should be war. For whatever reason, they didn't agree with the reasons for the war on either side. They wore pennies on their lapels in Congress and were compared to the poisonous snake by their opponents, Copperheads. Copperheads here are a very, very poisonous snake. They wore pennies. It's just a symbol. And they were compared to poisonous snakes, so they were called Copperheads. A guy named Clement Vallandigham, you don't see his name very often, was a vocal leader of that group. And one of the concerns they had was that Lincoln suspended habeas corpus and had him deported during the war. Habeas corpus, you're not supposed to be able to, anything happen to you without a fair trial, and you should be able to speak against government, all the things that we value. Sometimes in war, that doesn't happen. Sometimes people suspend the rules during war, and that was one of them. It's constitutional for a president to do that during a time of war or conflict. It doesn't go over real well, but it is legal. It's like terrorism. There are certain things you're allowed to do if you have great fear for your country and you feel it's an imminent danger. It's just a little difficult to figure out when that is and when it's abuse of power. So obviously that becomes a huge conflict. So another thing you need to know, the New York City draft riots. In the New York, because this is about the draft during the Civil War, you do need to know that in case you're asked. So it's called the Enrollment Act of 1863 meant that for the first time in history, the United States could draft troops. To draft troops means that you say you're in, you're here. You don't have a choice. You don't join. Remember in the Revolutionary War, people would join because they believed in the cause. In the Civil War, they started needing more troops. They needed more people. They needed more soldiers because the war was going on. People were dying. They were getting slaughtered. So they needed more. People weren't joining fast enough. So they put in the draft. And the draft means that if you're told to go, you go. New York City was a Democratic stronghold, and there was a lot of opposition to the draft. And some of the reasons there was so much opposition is that it wasn't really a fair draft. It favored the rich because if you got drafted at that time, you could pay someone to take your place. Now, later on when we had other wars, like the Vietnam War, people were drafted and killed by the tens of thousands, and you couldn't get out of the draft. If you were drafted, unless you had a deferment, which was a waiver because you were a student or married. There were a few reasons you could get out, but you couldn't pay someone to take your place. So this draft favored the rich because you could pay someone $300 or just find a substitute, find someone to go in your place. I don't want to go to war, but you could go for me. And $300 was a huge amount of money at that time, so it wasn't, most people couldn't afford it. So the common slogan at the time was, it was a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. And you'll even hear that now. People will say a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight, because it's usually people who can't afford to get waivers or deferments, either because in this case they can't pay it, or later years when it was because you were going to college, you wouldn't have to go in the draft until you were finished with college. And not everybody, people who didn't have money often weren't in college because they couldn't afford it. So still it became that it was a poor man's war. But this all came up in the Civil War because it was the first draft. So rich man's war, poor man's fight, $300 if somebody would take your place, or if you could get a friend, get someone to go for you. I don't know how that works. Another thing you need to know about that is there was a lot of racial conflict between the Irish and the African American populations, because they were competing for the same jobs and housing in New York City. Remember, the Irish came in after the potato famines, and they were Catholic, and they had all the signs, no Catholic need apply. They were really treated badly and discriminated against, and it was really awful. But they stayed in the cities because they didn't have farming. They didn't really have any specialized farming skills. So, and also the African American populations who got out of the South and made it to New York, or they kind of started, a lot of them lived in New York. It was a much better place to live, and they wanted to move into the cities, and they needed to get jobs and housing. So there was some real problems with the Irish and African competition in New York. The Emancipation Proclamation also meant that New York's Irish troops would be fighting for African American slaves. So you have all of that the racist issues that go on. You have a lot of conflict between those two. There was both anti-war and anti-Republican sentiment in Democratic New York City at the time. So the riots erupted in July 1863 and led to violence against poor and affluent African Americans, Republican supporters, and rich whites. You might also note that the South also instituted a draft with the passage of their Conscription Act, which is the draft, of 1862. They furnished 20 slaves would get one out of the Southern draft. So if you were drafted in the South after the Conscription Act, and that is just the act to draft people in the South of 1862, if you gave them 20 slaves, you could get out of the draft. So in the North, it was paying $300. In the South, it was 20 slaves. Election of 1864. Okay, for Lincoln's second term, he defeated George McClellan. You probably won't hear much about him. He had fired him as commander of the Potomac earlier. Lincoln chose Andrew Johnson, a pro-Union Southern Democrat from Tennessee. Now, what's interesting about that is Tennessee had seceded. They had left. But Johnson was pro-Union. Even though he was a Southern Democrat, he was pro-Union. So the South saw him as a traitor, and the North didn't really trust him. So I'm not sure it was the best choice, because he also took over when Lincoln was assassinated later, and it caused a few problems because he wasn't popular on either side. So it did cause some conflicts during Reconstruction. But that's a little bit later. So in 64, Lincoln won his second term with Andrew Johnson as his vice president. So the definition total war is something you might hear about, and it's the idea that war used to be where the armies all converged on a battlefield. Like in the Revolutionary War, you would have both sides showing up, and you would have two lines of guys shooting at each other because the weapons were not very good for distance, so there was a lot of close-up action. The Civil War changed that. William Tecumseh Sherman waged war on every aspect of society. It wasn't just out on the battlefield with soldier against soldier. In this war, unfortunately, it also included civilians. There was a lot of damage done to people's homes, plantations, their property. So Sherman was known as a pretty brutal guy. He marched his soldiers from Atlanta to Savannah in 1864 and burnt everything in between. So instead of the battlefield being the place where the soldiers go to fight, a little army against army or whatever, this became going out and purging the entire society, people, families. It was pretty awful. So when you hear about Sherman's march to the sea or any of, there's some terms about Sherman, but they all mean that he just started going and burned everything in his path, destroyed everything in his path. So Atlanta to Savannah, 1864, Sherman's march, burning everything in between, plantations, family homes, pretty much total destruction. Okay, so in the West, what you need to know about the Civil War is the Union had a little more success in the West. The Battle of Shiloh, 1862. The Union won on the second day, and that's where Ulysses S. Grant became well known. He wasn't known much before that, but I guess it just takes a big battle when you do well for a general or somebody to become well known. So that was important for Ulysses S. Grant. And that was the Battle of Shiloh, 1862. So that's Ulysses S. Grant became well known then, so you need to know that. Battle of New Orleans in 1862 also was led by Admiral David Farragut, Farragut. And the Union won an important naval battle under his command. So these are important Union or the North battles that you need to know. So that was the Battle of New Orleans, 1862. David Farragut, important naval battle. All right, Siege of Vicksburg, 1863. At that point, the Union won the battle and was able to divide the Confederacy in half because it then controlled the Mississippi River. And you know from our earlier classes how important the Mississippi River is and how far it goes in terms of our geography. And so if you could control the Mississippi River, you could basically control a large area. And in this case, it cut the land, the Confederacy, in half and kind of split them up. So it gave them a little more control. So that's the Siege of Vicksburg in 1863. Okay, so other things you need to know about the Civil War after Gettysburg, which you know the Gettysburg Address and the important Battle of Gettysburg, is that General Grant took over the command of the Army at the Potomac. So General Grant was a Northern general. He took over the army. So you kind of see how the two leaders are gaining prominence here. All right, so between 1864 and 1865, he chased Lee, Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general. He was chasing him through Virginia through different battles. So through Virginia, the Battle of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, Pittsburgh, and ultimately, after he's chasing Lee, and not just Lee, Lee and his men, sounds like there's two guys chasing each other, Lee finally surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, which is the name of the town, Appomattox, on April 9th, 1865. So that's important to know that General Lee of the Confederacy surrendered to General Grant of the North and the Union at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th, 1865. All right. Now, the terms of the surrender were pretty good. Lee's army returned home. It's not as though they had prisoners and captured them. It wasn't a foreign country where they took over. They basically said, okay, we win. Now you're going to have to come back into the Union. We're going to have to make this work. Lee's army returned home, and the idea of the Reconstruction, putting it back together, was going to begin. The war ended with over 600,000 lives lost. The American Civil War, Americans against Americans, cost 600,000 lives. One of the things you need to know about that is most of the deaths were caused by disease and lack of medical care more than being shot or killed on the battlefield. A lot of these people died just because they were in close proximity with other people, and there were so many diseases and so much unknown in the medical field that people just would die by the thousands from disease. that was being spread. Okay, so that is important to know. Some of the innovations of the Civil War, if you see anything about that, as the first modern war, there were things that were seen on the battlefield that weren't seen in previous wars. Trench warfare, which became more prevalent after Gettysburg, was commonplace in World War One. The biggest man-made explosion in the U.S. during its day is the Battle of the Crater at Petersburg, Virginia, where Union troops detonated an underground mine. Before that, it was mostly hand-to-hand or guns, but this was an explosion, an underground mine. The use of the ironclad ships, the ships with much better metal iron protection on the outside. They had metal sides to them, so they were able to defend themselves against bullets, guns, whatever's coming from the shores and the other ships. They even had some improvements. Some submarine and torpedo technology was just beginning then. So warfare was changing. Plus the use of the telegraph for communication. Before that, people couldn't communicate great distances. So when things were happening, people would know about it for weeks at another location. So the telegraph made that whole communication much easier, which changed the way people planned and functioned in war. All right, John Wilkes Booth. You need to know John Wilkes Booth. You probably already do. He assassinated Abraham Lincoln. He was the guy who assassinated Lincoln April 14th, 1865. It was said to be a part of a larger conspiracy to target members of government. He shot Lincoln at Ford's Theater when he went to see a play with his wife, Our American Cousin. So sometimes that will come up. What was a play Lincoln was watching when he was killed? It's Our American Cousin. He was at Ford's Theater with his wife, April 15th, 1865. The John Wilkes Booth waited until the show had the part of the show that had the loudest laughter so that it could cover some of the shot, and then he pulled the trigger, and then he leapt onto the stage and broke his leg. He still managed to escape. He was killed 12 days later. Andrew Johnson, is what I tried to say, became president when Lincoln died the next day. Lincoln lived through the night, and he died the next day, which, of course, his vice president, as is the law under our Constitution, became president. Remember, that was a guy who was a representative of Tennessee. He was from the South, but he didn't believe in the fact that his state had seceded, so he stayed in Congress. So the South didn't like him, even though he was from their state, and he was in Congress representing them, and the North didn't really like him because he was a Southerner. So when it came to the idea of Reconstruction, which is putting the country back together again, it was difficult.